Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Joining me today again is Darius, and our topic for today is Active Directory Security Quick Wins for Defender. How's it going, Darius? Same shirt guy.
Yeah, I'm doing great. I'm rocking, the official offensive security 360 offensive security shirt. So that's awesome. It's a brand new year. So I'm really looking forward to everything that we have planned.
Yeah, definitely. And so I picked out this topic. I wanted to talk about Active Directory security and some quick wins for defenders to kind of start the year off on a good foot. I wanted to introduce this episode in a way that hopefully makes sense for everybody and that everybody can kind of relate with. So Active Directory is hard, right? Darius, you've administered Active Directory. You've done sysadmin work in the past. I have a long background in IT administration and systems administration. And I know firsthand how difficult Active Directory can be and how complex it can be and kind of the hidden dangers, right? And what I've found in the last year and a half or so of doing pen tests at Secure IT 360 is that a lot of firms have similar issues, right? They fail at similar complex things, or maybe some not so complex things. But a lot of firms have a lot of the same issues in their internal environment. And so one of the reasons I suppose that is just my theory, is that most IT people are not experts in any one thing, right? Darius, from your experience, you probably had to do a lot of different things, right?
Yep. Oh, for sure. You wear many different hats in most environments.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you're a small IT team and you've only got a few people, you kind of have to do help desk, you have to do networking and systems administration and deal with Active Directory and firewalls and all these things. And you can't possibly be an expert in one discipline like Active Directory. And that brings me to kind of the idea that Active Directory is kind of full of administrative interfaces, and they don't necessarily warn you when you make a mistake, right? So one of the examples that we'll talk about later on is nested group membership and how that can kind of get things mucked up, and you can kind of give access to accounts you didn't really expect. Well, if you add domain users to domain admins, I mean, Active Directory doesn't really care. It doesn't warn you and say, hey, whoa, that's probably a bad idea, right? So, it's hard to pick up on some of those mistakes if you're not looking for them. So kind of to round out the introduction of this is complexity leads to mistakes. Mistakes lead to misconfigurations. Misconfigurations lead to incidents. And incidents, unfortunately, lead to breaches. So Darius, is that a pretty good introduction of what we wanted to talk about? Anything I missed in kind of like introducing this topic?
Yeah, I would say that pretty much rounds it out. Only thing I'll add is I think, another thing that I think you often see in an environment, you're on the IT team, an event happens, stuff stops working. And so, what a lot of times what ends up happening is you find the solution, and it may not be the best solution, but it fixes your problem now. Like to your example, maybe there's some weird incident where, hey, us adding every user to domain admin fixes the problem. If we're a small firm, we might say, hey, the problem is fixed. We'll go back to it because we know, it's not the most secure way of handling things. And then we just never do because, the next fire pops up.
Yeah.
Overall, it's exactly like you said, Active Directory, there's so many components, there's so many pieces to it. And a lot of times with the IT team, similar to development teams, you're trying to keep the lights on, you're trying to make improvements. And then that's where you see security teams are trying to go behind and say like, hey, this is what we need to do. And depending on your maturity level, that may or may not happen.
Yep, definitely. And that's a good segue, because one of the first things we wanted to talk about is we're eventually going to talk about the quick wins, and we're going to talk about some findings that we normally see on internals and some guidance around them. But first, I think it makes sense to kind of articulate or kind of describe what these issues look like, how they manifest, and kind of what the impact can be of them. So the first one is weak passwords. We talked about this last week, Darius, and with Tyler on external pen tests and how we turned an external into an internal due to weak passwords and some other things. But ultimately, what we talked about last week was we compromised an account that had a weak password through password spraying. We logged in through a remote access system. It was like a Citrix or a VMware or something like that, right? We would log in and we performed a Kerberoasting attack on their domain. We got access to the built-in administrator account, which was a couple issues there, we can talk about. But then we cracked the hash, right? So we Kerberoasted and got the hash for the administrator account. We then cracked the hash. It was just in a few minutes. I think it was like a 9-character password. It was very weak. And then, we went from external access to foothold to domain admin within just a few minutes, all because there was weak passwords, right? Weak passwords in a couple places. And so, one of the things that we'll talk about in a little bit and how to mitigate this, and one of the things, but one of those things is weak passwords, right? That's, I think, plagues all of our organizations, no matter if you're a Fortune 100, Fortune 50, or a small 5-person firm or whatever. Weak passwords, affects everybody.
Oh, for sure.
File shares.
For sure. Yeah.
File shares, right? This is one of my favorites as an internal pen tester. Darius knows this. I talk about this every week, right? It's like every week on every pen test. I'm educating clients on the dangers of putting documents out there or having documents that they don't really know are out there. On one engagement, I found a binary, a .NET binary that looked kind of custom made. When I ran it, it looked like it was kind of somebody that had made it custom. It didn't look like it was part of any familiar software package that I knew, and it didn't look like it was used. It looked fairly old. The date modified was several years out, maybe 4, 5, 6 years old, something like that. So I took it and I ran strings on that binary, and sure enough, I found credentials hard-coded in that binary that led to an enterprise admin account. So again, just kind of using some stuff that's already there to take advantage of the access that we already had. Yeah, and I know, Darius, you've got another example too on this as well.
Yeah, it's pretty funny, because on the one hand, it's like we're penetration testers. That sounds really cool. Everyone's like, oh, so like you hack stuff, you must do all this advanced cool stuff.
Right.
When it's like 90% of the time, it's like, yeah, I just gotta searched your file shares and you had credentials.
Yep. Yeah, and it's funny, right? Because we talk about pen tests every week. We share our techniques, and we're always constantly educating each other. And every week Darius does this cool like web hacking thing, and then here I am, like, oh yeah, I found a password in a text file. It makes me feel like way lower skilled than Darius, because Darius is pulling off these complex like web attacks, right? That take understanding and stuff, and here I am just opening text files and like
you give me too much credit. But also, at the end of the day, that's what threat actors are going to do. There's why waste a 0 day when you can open up a script and there are the credentials, which kind of leads to the next point. In addition to the file shares, this is something that I'm really big on, especially, and I'm going to really try to push for this year. Is this concept and this idea right now, like we're getting to the point now where IT teams and infrastructure teams, they're writing scripts, whether it's a batch script, PowerShell script. You see the rise of infrastructure as code. So if you're, if you have a cloud environment, you may have scripts to auto deploy resources and things of that nature. And really, we need to treat those things exactly like you would treat, a team of developers working on a web app, which means you need to have change control. And then also you need to make sure that, we're not hard coding credentials in scripts. So in this particular instance, I've had this happen twice so far. So one was on an internal pen test, and the other one was on a web app pen test that then turned into an internal. In both scenarios, just looking around the file system, you'll find scripts. And within those scripts, For example, in this particular instance, I found credentials for a database admin account. And so not only do you get the username and password, but you even get the server name, you get the connection string. So
Yeah.
everything you need all in one place. And then from there, you access the SQL Server. And in one case, XP Command Shell was enabled, and the other, the account had permissions to turn XP Command Shell on. And so, for those who don't know, that's just the ability to run OS commands via SQL queries. Um, and so, with that, at that point, you now have lateral movement. Um, and so, this is all because scripts were left credentials were left in a script somewhere.
Yep. Yeah, and I remember the same thing on several internals where XP Command Shell is enabled, and finding DBA credentials in logon scripts and things like that. So definitely very pervasive issue there. The last kind of example story, I guess we will call it, is nested groups / delegations, I'm calling it. So on one particular internal, I found plain text passwords for an admin account. Now, this admin account was just an admin account for like IT purposes. So it could reset some limited passwords. I had some very limited rights in the environment. It couldn't really do a whole lot, except for that it was in several groups that were nested within domain admins. So upon first glance, it was like, oh, it's just this admin account and can do these few things. But then as you dig into it more, you start looking at the groups and you saw that it was nested several layers deep, ultimately being in domain admins. And so it was kind of this situation where an administrator either intentionally or maybe unintentionally added it to a group that was then in a group that was in another group that was in domain admins. And so that's what I meant earlier about it kind of being unintended, right? You might have a service accounts OU and you might have some service account groups, and one of those groups unintendedly might be in domain admins or another privileged group. And, just out of the course of doing work and maintenance, you add it to that group. And, sure enough, that account is now a domain admin. So those are some of the example stories that I think will help kind of set the stage for some of the issues that we're going to talk about, and the quick wins and how to mitigate them. So we'll back up a little bit to the first one being passwords. So in that first story, we talked about, weak passwords. We sprayed an account, we got access, we Kerberoasted, we got access to the built-in administrator account through cracking that hash. So passwords. This is kind of a contentious thing when you talk about it, I guess, in IT and security, because like, how long is enough? And like, do you reset it? Do you make users reset it on a periodic basis? Do you not make them reset it? So my own personal guidance and this obviously may vary, Darius, between you and I even, 12 to 15 for users, I think is a good minimum. Obviously longer is better, but for, a organization, a firm that's trying to roll out a decent password policy, I would say at least 12, if not 15 to be safe. And then as long as possible for admins and service accounts. So there's many ways for you to administer this and maintain those passwords, but definitely make admin accounts, service accounts as long as possible, and definitely don't use anything that's easily guessable. Obviously related to the company name or any related to something geographically like that. But what do you think, Darius, about strong passwords and passwords for users and admin accounts?
So I think a little bit differently. I think for users, I think of it kind of like a sliding scale in the sense of, I think 12 to 15 is great. If you want to do something lower, I think if you're going to do that, because I recognize, in some environments, you're trying to strike that balance between, you don't want to upset your users too much.
Right.
And you don't want to make things so hard on them that they start, putting sticky notes underneath keyboards, right? So you have to strike the balance for your environment. I think if you are going to have, a password policy with fewer characters, then you should be changing those policies more frequently. And if you have a password policy that requires longer policies, maybe, not so much. So I do think it's a sliding scale. That's kind of how I look at it for user accounts. But for admin and service accounts, oh yeah, wholeheartedly agree. Like you should toss everything at it. You know, um, long characters, MFA, etc. You should definitely implement that for admin and service accounts for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll echo that, Darius. It's that like all the advice that we or anybody else gives you is like contingent upon you, your environment, your firm, your organization, your culture, and things like that. So definitely agree. With admin accounts too, I will say, you said, throw the kitchen sink at it, right? So start looking for some sort of password vaulting solution, not LastPass, some sort of PIM solution, or something like that for admin of service accounts that can auto rotate, that you can check in accounts and check them out, has some of the more advanced features for those admin and service accounts. And then also providing something for users, right? Users are going to write down their passwords, whether you like it or not. My preference is that they put it in some sort of secure vault, right? And not in my document management system or in the file shares or in scripts. Give users something that they can use to securely manage those passwords.
So you touched on one thing that I do want to talk about a little bit more, and that's PIM. So, that's privileged identity management. And I'm looking at this purely from an Azure standpoint, because I think they do it really well and I'm familiar with it, is,
Yep.
Having admin accounts, but, having it set so that those admin accounts doesn't always have those admin permissions. And I think that's really where PIM comes in handy, that you can have, admin or even end user accounts where when needed, elevate, get those permissions. You can set it for like, hey, you're only given these permissions for X period of time. You can even set up an approval process. There's so many things you can do. And I think that right there kind of adds an extra control that can really benefit environments.
Yeah, and when you implement that, you can say that you're implementing zero trust, because like that is one of the tenets of zero trust is, you don't just by default trust an account, right? You're checking out the account, it's given the access, it's restricted for a certain period of time from a certain place, yada, 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 and then it's gone, right? Like you can't use that password, that account isn't there, you can't use it.
You avoid privilege creep. And I've even seen workflows where, like, hey, this is my admin account. I'm going to request, to elevate, let's say request to elevate to global admin in Azure, and I have to provide a reason. It's things like that that really, I think is an easy win, once you set it up, and it'll save you a lot of heartache in the future.
Yeah. And authentication as a whole, Darius, like we could do entire episodes just on authentication, right? And the best practices for that, zero trust and PIM and PAM and all these things. It's one of the most, foundational components to security is authentication. All users have access to applications, or they need applications and they need access to them. So authentication is just so core to what we do every day that it's so important. On top of this, is reviewing those passwords, right? Or having some sort of cadence, like you mentioned here, Darius, an audit cadence to make sure that your accounts are adhering to that policy, right? Maybe you don't test the passwords themselves, but maybe you make sure that the accounts in your environment are adhering to the policies that they're supposed to, right? If you have service accounts, making sure that the fine-grained password policy is applied to that group or that OU. Rather, a lot of things you can do, but kind of setting your work and then checking it periodically is really important.
Agreed.
So that was strong passwords, right? Passwords are important. This is a common thing that we see, or weak passwords is common we see, I guess. Second is reviewing places that have that commonly have plain text credentials. Darius, you mentioned scripts earlier. This is common for me on internals, on file shares, in PowerShell console history, in event logs, in all sorts of files on file systems. So my own personal recommendations on internals is to audit file shares, audit the document management systems, and look for those files, right? I've got some, tips and tricks for that, of like strings to look for. But the obvious ones make sense, right, Darius? Like searching your file shares for the word password
Yep.
or just starting off like that is a really good idea.
So number three, we have unique local admin passwords. So that's super important. So if you're not aware, there's a tool called Laps, which basically allows you to each computer or endpoint on your network to have its own unique local admin password. And I think that that is crucial to implement. It's 2023. If you aren't implementing this in your environments, you need to prioritize it. For the simple fact of if you're not, once we crack the local admin password on one endpoint, we can now pretty much own your entire network because we can go anywhere
Yep.
at that point.
Yeah, and a lot of times in many environments, most environments, I would say, we don't even need the password because if we can get the hash of that administrative account, we can then do something called pass the hash, and essentially it's just using the hash, to authenticate to another system, right? So maybe I'm not able to get the plain text password because I can't crack it. Maybe it is a long password, but usually I'll just be able to use the hash and pass that to another system and use that to authenticate with. So definitely a big deal. And it's something that I see very often is, once I get one admin password, I can pretty much go wherever I want because all the passwords are the same, unfortunately.
And it's super easy to implement too. There's so many guides on Laps.
Yep.
I think Microsoft has really done a good job, I think, of making it extremely easy to implement without impacting your end users.
Yep.
So I think this is a no-brainer and definitely like an easy win if you're a security team and you're just looking for an easy win to kind of show leadership. Implementing Laps is a really good one.
Yeah, and Microsoft is doubling down on this. They're implementing or have implemented Laps for like Azure AD join devices so that you can manage them in Azure AD. I'm pretty sure that's kind of like how the setup is supposed to work. I'm not an expert at Laps by any means, but Microsoft is definitely not getting rid of this anytime soon. They are still supporting it quite heavily, even in the Azure world when you have Azure AD joined devices or hybrid joined and things like that. So definitely take a look at that for randomizing your local admin account passwords. Group membership. I mentioned we were going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So my guidance for this is essentially look for nested group membership and look for group membership that may be overly permissive. So that example I gave earlier was there's this IT admin account that was in a couple groups. It didn't look very obvious. But when you start looking at the group membership, you could see that the intended purpose of this account was to administer this small set of things, but it was in these groups that kind of gave it more access just based on what I could understand about the groups that it was in. So you all know your environments better than anyone. So review your groups and make sure you document them well and understand what those groups are for and what access those have been given, so you can kind of accurately restrict those groups and those accounts to just what they're needed. There's a concept called least privilege, and that's kind of where this comes in, right? Is restrict those accounts accordingly. And then, as Darius has mentioned, auditing, right? We can come back to almost everything to be like audit, review your work, right, Darius? Like just check stuff on a regular basis.
And I say that as because I was the guy kind of at a few places I've worked at before where I was the privilege creep account. It's like I'm young, I'm hungry. I'm like, hey, let me try this, and eventually you end up with like a super account, which shouldn't happen. So definitely auditing those accounts and those changes on a consistent basis. Definitely needed for sure.
And it's kind of like an ugly word, I guess, but change control. It's like, it's like this weird word where it's like change control. What's that? Is this like a whole change control board and approval processes and like rollback plans and everything? It's like, well, it can be that detailed, right, Darius? But like you can do it easier too.
I think, it really comes down to finding the process that works for you and your team. So like, if you make it, if your change control process is too intensive, I guess I'll phrase it that way, no one's going to want to do it. So with all things, you want to find that middle ground. But man, it will definitely, save you some heartache in the long run. Like pretty much everything we talked about, if you have a change control process in place, you can prevent some of these things from happening to you. And I would even go further. Once again, scripts should be treated like development. There should be a change control process before
Yep.
any type of script goes to production. Before a task is scheduled and the script goes
Yep.
live, there should be some form of change control and some sort of process so that at least the second set of eyes is looking over. They're making sure there's not hard coded credentials. To
Yep.
your point, making sure all the standards, whatever the standards for the environment are, making sure they're being met. Making sure, hey, there's this config file that you're saving in this file share that everyone has access to that has credentials in it, just things of that nature.
Yep.
Change control can really help, prevent some of those things. So definitely agree about at least at the bare minimum, if you don't at least if you don't have a change control process, at least have someone have a second set of eyes on
Yep.
anything you do before you just press the
Yep.
button.
And document, right? I've been on internal yeah, documentation, right? It's the most grueling, like difficult part of the process, right? Is you've done all the work and preparation and stuff for this thing. Now you have to document it all, right? Yeah, I think it's the hardest part of any kind of work, right? But it's so important to be able to go back and look like, oh yeah, I added this group or I added this user to this group so we could install this thing, but it's only needed for this certain period of time, and then you forget about it, right? But you go back to your notes that you had because you documented, and you can see why that change was made, and you can recall that information and handle it. If you don't have any notes or documentation, right, you have no idea. And I'll give another example. I was on an internal where the everyone group, like the everyone group, was granted generic all on the root domain of this environment. And no one knows how it happened. It was likely somebody in IT that had left the organization. So a little bit of technical debt because somebody left who apparently made the change. And there's no documentation for it, so no one really knew how it got made or when or why. And those can be really difficult because let's say they needed some sort of access, right? That could have broke a core application that they needed. So really important to document those changes and have a change control process for sure.
So we talked about a couple of quick wins. What are some tools that we can use to kind of implement some of those quick wins? I know we talked about Laps, but I feel like there are a few others.
Yeah, definitely. A tool that I love preaching is Pingcastle. I talk about this all the time, but Pingcastle is one of my favorite tools, both as a pen tester, as somebody who helps defenders, who helps blue teams, somebody who does assessments on a regular basis. Pingcastle is really great. It's essentially an Active Directory health check tool. And when I say Active Directory, it pretty much covers, hundreds of different checks in Active Directory. And it'll look for things as simple as passwords in group policies to looking at more complex things like misconfigured certificate templates and group membership and a whole slew of things. And it's free. So Pingcastle is free for anyone to use on their own environment. So I definitely recommend Pingcastle.
Nice.
Bloodhound. Yeah, go ahead, Darius.
So, you mentioned Bloodhound. I like that one. That's a great one. And what I was going to say is, with all the tools that you have, Spencer, for your point, I think the majority, all of these are free to some extent. And I think just even if you're a small team, if you're unable to pay someone to come in and do this for you, I think these tools really make it easy for you to do it on your own.
Yep.
You talked about a cadence, set up a cadence, run it.
Yep.
You'll essentially have a checklist of things to fix and work on them as you can, run it again. So
Yep.
I think all these tools, very easy to run in your environment and can lead to a quick win.
Yeah, definitely. And it shows initiative, like you said. It shows leadership, that you're tracking things and that you're prioritizing things and things are getting fixed. So yeah, Pink Castle, Bloodhound, Purple Knight, all free tools. There's tons of documentation and videos and things like that about how to use those things and what to look for. The great thing is, like, you run the tools, at least for Pink Castle and Purple Hound. Yeah, Pink Castle and Purple Hound. I don't know why.
Purple Hound, that's
Pink
a new
Castle
one.
and Purple Knight. There's too many like dual word like tools, like Ping Castle, Bloodhound, Purple Knight. Ping Castle and Purple Knight, both are like Active Directory health assessment tools. Both of them will tell you the issue. They'll tell you like why it's an issue, the impact, but then they'll also tell you how to fix it and how to validate that it's fixed. So it literally, quite literally, gives you all the information you need. You just have to go and do the thing and then run the tool again and see if it's gone, right? So really, really easy to use tools that provide a lot of value for literally free.
And a lot of those tools also, for those who have to kind of, validate and show things to executive level officers and things of that nature. A lot of these tools, you can export reports and they look really nice as well. They're easy to read and digest. So, why not use them? I'll say, Bloodhound, you'll be surprised at what you'll find. The one obscure end user who potentially, it's the start of getting all the way to DA. It's there, so why not run it, see what you'll find. I know sometimes it can be a little bit daunting and scary because you're like, once you run it, and you have to do something about it. But that's why we're here, right?
Yeah, exactly. Once you peel back the curtain, that's it. Like, you can't unsee the message. Somebody was talking about this on Twitter just recently. It's like, if you're checking emails and messages after work, don't be surprised when you see a message. It's like, hey, there's something weird going on. Like, you can't ignore it at that point. It's like, if you're checking messages after hours, like after your shift is over, you can't complain if you see an issue that you have to respond to. It's the same kind of thing, right? You start running these tools, they're going to have some findings. Be prepared to address those or have a plan to address them. So cool. We talked about a lot. I think this episode was jam-packed, Darius, with a lot of different things. Any last minute words of wisdom, advice, or consolation?
Man, only I could say is, hey, it's 2023, it's the beginning of the year. I know for a lot of security teams and those of the industry, last year was something with all the breaches. But, we just have to, keep doing what we're doing. Try to implement some of these quick wins to the best of your ability. And like always, if you can't get buy-in, at least document. So
exactly. Sure. Well, that's our show for today. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a follow, like, subscribe, and definitely share this episode with your peers, colleagues, friends. If you got value from this or you enjoyed it, helps us reach more people, helps us get our message out there and get some of this information into other people's hands that might not have seen it otherwise. And we hope we brought you some value through this episode. So that's our show. We'll see you next time.